Today I will walk you through some of the most important components of developing a plot. I'm calling this Plot Development 101. One of the most important things you want to think about when developing your plot is that conflict that happens early on in the story. The conflict comes right after the exposition in the story, and it often involves the main character wanting something. And that's why we use the words somebody wanted when summarizing. Here are some examples on how you can use the phrase somebody wanted when developing the conflict in the beginning of a story. So here we have somebody wanted to defeat, somebody wanted to overcome, to learn, to escape, to conquer, to feel a certain way, and to survive, to name just a few. Today we will touch upon the four most common conflicts that you will see in a plot. We have person versus self, person versus person, person versus nature, and person versus society. These conflicts can also be used in a fantasy novel or story. So rather than saying person to self, person versus person, it's going to be referred to as being versus self, being versus being, and so forth. So you can still use these same conflicts with imaginary characters or animals in a fantasy story. Let's start with person versus self. With this type of conflict, it may include a journey or a quest to find themselves. The conflict in the beginning could be an animal or a being or a person wondering who they are, and the rest of the story goes into a quest and the journey. The internal conflict of a person or being against self could involve the thought and choice between good and bad. Remind you that internal means inside. So this would involve the person's conscience, in other words, their thoughts. So the conflict in the beginning of a story might involve someone having to make a hard decision. So for example, someone might have to decide between going to a friend's birthday or helping their grandmother who really needs the help, who is sick, which leads to their actions and decisions and the plot line. The next type of conflict we have is person versus nature. Now, this could involve anything where the person or the being or the animal is encountering something in the natural world. And this can even take place in a fantasy setting as well. So maybe the driving factor for this kind of plot would be in the beginning, the character wants to prepare for a storm. Next, we have the conflict of person versus person. And coming back to that connection that we make with our reading when we do a summary, you may try to include this when planning your conflict for person to person. So for example, you might think that somebody wants to defeat, or somebody wants to overcome, or somebody wants to teach in the person-to-person conflict. And finally, we have person versus society. Examples of this include wanting to stand up for the common good, wanting to stand up for a personal belief, or maybe wanting to make a change with a particular law or policy. Another factor you will want to consider when planning your plot is whether or not you are going to incorporate some sort of theme. The theme is the life lesson, meaning, moral, or message about life or human nature that is communicated through the plot in a story. You may also say that the theme is what the story teaches the reader. It's the message that you can take away after reading a full story. Here are some themes that can be conveyed over the course of a plot. Acceptance, courage, perseverance, kindness, friendship, bravery, freedom, honesty, loyalty, even cooperation. Before beginning to write any story, you want to ask yourself, how will the events of my story unfold? And of course, you must plan. Step one is to decide whether or not you want to create a fantasy or realistic fiction plot for your story. The next thing you're going to want to do is start brainstorming ideas for a plot. That's going to start with thinking about potential conflicts or things that might happen in the beginning of the story that's going to drive the rest of the plot line. So, in the plot, we start with the exposition and exposing ourselves to our characters and our readers, and then we have the conflict, which is that driving factor for the rest of the story. After that, we have the rising actions that lead to the climax. However, for step 3, I recommend thinking about your climax. So again, step 2, you're going to think about the conflict. You're going to want to start brainstorming if there are any themes that you want to kind of portray throughout the events in your story. So you want that conflict and you want to just brainstorm, what could that potentially be? And what do you want it to lead to? What will be that most exciting point in your story? What will be that climax, that turning point, that ultimate factor? From there, I tend to find it easier to go back and then include the rising action events. If this does not suit your style in planning for your story, that's okay. But again, I like to think of the conflict. What is the problem in the beginning? Where do I want it to end up? And then I can go back and I can think of the events that are going to lead me to that climax. And those rising action events are part of the quest or journey in your story, especially if you are writing a fantasy or fictional story. So a quest is an adventurous journey that is undergone by the main character, usually the protagonist of a story. And the protagonist usually meets with and overcomes this series of obstacles, returning in the end with the benefits of knowledge and experience from the quest. Then step 5 involves including some falling actions that happen after our climax. Once we reach that most exciting turning point in our story, we cannot just abruptly end. We want to think of what are some things that are going to happen after that are going to lead to the resolution. Step 6 will involve planning your resolution. How do you want your story to be resolved? How do you want it to end? You will want your story to come full circle, especially if you're including a theme or a message that you're trying to convey to your reader. So again, you're going to start with the conflict. There's a problem in the beginning. And when I say come full circle is that resolution in the end of your story should connect to that initial conflict. How was that solved? What events led to connecting in the end? And did it end up leaving us with a message or a theme? The next part of planning your plot and your story is to develop the characters. We will do that in a separate lesson. In the next lesson, I will guide you in a step-by-step process for how to brainstorm a creative narrative. In the meantime, I hope this gets you thinking and you can start jotting down some ideas for what could potentially be a conflict. Do you want to have a conflict that is person versus person versus self? Will you want a theme? What kind of theme? You can jot down several different ideas on where you want to go with your story right away. Mention that you could always draw pictures as well. Draw pictures of what the setting of your story is going to look like. What do you imagine your characters being like? And as always, just have fun.